Hotel. Hotel. Welcome to Journey in the Soul. I'm your host, Sarah. Today, I decided that we would do a show. We titled it Donald Trump Outsider or Establishment Insider. The reason that I chose to do the show at this time is because Mr. Trump seems to be quite prominent in the news for various reasons, not the least of which is the fact that he happens to be the front runner for the Republican Party's race for the presidency, for the Republican nominee for the general election, despite the fact that he has not participated in any debates. He's been charged with a myriad of crimes. He still continues to be the front runner for the Republicans. Part of the reason that would be is because of a myth that has been created around Donald Trump. And part of that myth has to do with this belief on behalf of many people, and including some Black people, that Donald Trump is an insider, or excuse me, outsider, that Donald Trump is an outsider, that he's not part of the quote unquote establishment. He's outside of what is referred to these days as the deep state, some nebulous term that's undefined by anyone. So we're going to get into the facts about Donald Trump and who he's connected with, and who helped put him in the action arena, as my brother, teacher, mentor, and friend, Brother Steve Coakley would say. And I would be remiss to even start doing this show and even trying to approach this subject without acknowledging Brother Steve Coakley, because if it were not for him, I wouldn't know much of this information that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. So if you have a glass with any kind of beverage in it, do pour libation for our dear brother who has made his transition to the ancestors, Brother Steve Coakley. Ashe. So, with that, in order for me to do this properly, I will need to provide some background information to establish who the establishment is. As we learned from Brother Steve, we don't like using terms, nebulous terms such as the establishment, the deep state, the man, or whatever, because it is not specific. It gives an impression that there's something mysterious about it. And mystery seems to be considered to be like an all-powerful thing that cannot be overcome. You know, much like, as Steve would say, you know, the Wizard of Oz. You know, there's this illusion put out about it, but when you're able to identify it and, you know, pull back the curtain, we find that He's just a pawn. So we will name some names, as Brother Steve was famous for doing. And we will name some of the names that are behind him and show his connection to it to establish that Mr. Trump is indeed not an outsider. He is very much an insider, but he was put in the action arena, as it were, to appear as though he is an outsider. And many people have fallen for it. Okay, so now that we've basically established what our goal is tonight, I'm reading from the book, The World Order. Note that it does not say the New World Order. It's the World Order because the author, Eustace Mullins, maintains that in the order, the world order is not something that's new, but goes back a few millennia, thousands of years, can be traced back to older secret societies, which have the same objective. Okay, so the principal character in our story is one Meyer Amschel Bauer, who would later change his name to Rothschild after a red shield that he placed on the mantle of his home, or actually not the mantle, but he placed the shield on the front door, a red shield, thus the name Rothschild, which means red shield. Okay, he was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1743. He served a 3-year apprenticeship in Hanover at the Bank of Oppenheim. And during this period, he had on occasion to be of service to Lieutenant General Baron von Esdorf, who was the principal advisor to the Landgrave of Hesse, and at the time was the wealthiest man in Europe. He inherited his wealth from his father. Baron van Esdorf was an advisor to the Landgrave of Hesse, and since Meyer Amschel Bauer was an associate of von Esdorf, he had the opportunity himself to be introduced to the Landgrave, and von Esdorf did indeed endorse him, introduce him and endorsed him as someone who had an uncanny ability to increase money through investments. And so Rothschild, then Bauer, became a financial advisor to the Landgrave of Hesse. And he was then helped the Landgrave to amass a considerable fortune, but this relationship ended up coming to an end when the Landgrave passed away at 25 years old. But Meyer Amschel then, in turn, gained absolute influence over his successor, Elector Wilhelm I, who was the same age as Mariam Shell, and they became really, really close. And so he essentially turned over control over his fortune um, to Mariam Shell. And as Mariam Shell ended up prospering from this arrangement, that's when he placed a large red shield over the door of the house that he inhabited with, along with the Schiff family, and he took the name then Rothschild based upon that sign. And he left £1 billion francs to his 5 sons, who he sent out throughout Europe to establish banking institutions throughout Europe. So the eldest son was placed in charge of the Frankfurt Bank in Germany. The second son, Salomon, was sent to Vienna, where he established a banking monopoly. Third son, Nathan, founded the London branch, which is now the Bank of England. Carl, the fourth son, went to Naples, Italy. And the youngest son, James, founded the French branch of the House of Rothschild in Paris, France. Okay, so thus strategically located, the book says the 5 sons began their lucrative operations in government finance, which is key. So they weren't making loans to companies, to individuals. They became the financiers of government. And that business expanded to the extent that since governments come to them for finance, they exercise a great deal of control over the governments. Indeed, Mariam Shell Rothschild is quoted as saying, "Let me but issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes their laws." It says the first precept of success in making government loans lies in creating a demand, that is, by taking part in the creation of financial panics, depressions, famines, wars, and revolutions. Have we not seen that occur? Okay, so the suggestion is then that all of the financial panics that have been experienced worldwide, including in this country, have been incited by the bankers. And if you go back into the history of this country, the people had become attuned to the fact that that was what was happening and became very anti-banker. And I will get into that a little bit later in the story, but that situation became manipulated in order to, in the bankers' favor, to where they would end up being able to consolidate their control, particularly in the United States, by the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. I think we'll get to that a little bit later. And so it says for the last 150 years, and this book was written in, this edition of the book was written in 1992. It says for the last 150 years, the history of the House of Rothschild has been to an amazing degree the backstage history of Western Europe. Okay. And I would suggest that it would also encompasses the history of the United States, because of the nature of the control that the Rothschild-controlled institutions have. Now, mind you, um, I mentioned briefly the Federal Reserve, and one of the, or actually two of the people who were responsible for creating the Federal Reserve were agents of Rothschild, one of which is Paul Warburg, who was the first chairman of the Federal Reserve. Okay. And so we'll go further into the book where it says that, in this part here, we're going to establish some of the organizations that ended up coming out of the union between Rothschild, the Rothschild family, and Cecil Rhodes. So it would be that those individuals ended up forming a secret society. So it says in 1895, Cecil Rhodes, who was a South African agent of the Rothschilds, established a secret society whose avowed purposes were as follows. In the end, Great Britain is to establish a power so overwhelming that wars must cease and the millennium be realized. To achieve this goal, he left $150 million to the Rhodes Trust. The Rothschild already had a group with similar aims, which was the Round Table Group, set up by Lord Alfred Milner, into which the J.P. Morgan had been recruited in 1899. Now, I would suggest here that the secret society that Cecil Rhodes did start was the Round Table Group, which both of them basically started. And we will, in a different book, go into the, how that was arranged, and we will go into the, some of the ancillary organizations that work outside of it to, or extensions that are extensions of it that work to basically carry out its functions. Okay, so I'm going to go and switch to another book, and the title of this book is None Dare Call It a Conspiracy, or None Dare Call It Conspiracy, by Gary Allen, I believe it is. Gary Allen and Larry Abraham. This would be a good book to have in your library. And if you can get an original copy, I would suggest that you do so. I don't know if any subsequent issues have been altered, like the what's that book? It'll come back to me. But there's a particular book where they've taken a whole chapter out of it, so just pay attention. So I'm going to go to page here. Bear with me. Okay. So I'm going to give you, kind of a bit of an overview, and this is going to be an extension of what we just read from the book The World Order. Okay, and so it says in 1919, Colonel House, who was an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, met in Paris with members of a British secret society called the Round Table Group in order to form an organization whose job it would be to propagandize the citizens of America, England, and Western Europe on the glories of world government. The big selling point, of course, was peace. The part about the insiders establishing a world dictatorship quite naturally was left out. The Round Table organization in England grew out of the lifelong dream of gold and diamond magnate Cecil Rhodes for a new world order. Rhodes's biographer, Sarah Milling, was a little bit more direct. As she put it, the government of the world was Rhodes's simple desire. Carroll Quigley, who wrote the book Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment, which was the principal book that basically shed light on these secret societies, particularly the Round Table Group. He's quoted as saying, in the middle 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million sterling a year, then about $5 million, which he spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually usually overdrawn on his account. Cecil Rhodes's commitment to a conspiracy to establish world government was set down in a series of wills described by Frank Adelot in his book American Rhodes Scholarship. Adelot writes, the 7 wills which Cecil Rhodes made between the ages of 24 and 46 constitute a kind of spiritual autobiography. Best known are the first, the Secret Society will, and the last, which established the Rhodes Scholarship. In his first will, Rhodes states that his aim, still more specifically, the extension of British rule throughout the world, the foundation of so great a power as to hereafter render wars impossible and promote the interests of humanity. The Confession of Faith enlarges upon these ideas, and the model for the proposed secret society was the Society of Jesus, though he mentions also the Masons, and the Society of Jesus would be the Jesuit order. It says, it should be noted that the originator of this type of secret society was Adam Weishaupt, the monster who founded the Order of the Illuminati on May 1st, 1776, for the purpose of conspiracy to control the world. The role of Weishaupt's Illuminists in such horrors as the Reign of Terror is in question, and the techniques of the Illuminati have long been recognized as models for communist methodology. Weishaupt used the structure as well of the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits as a model and rewrote his code in Masonic terms. Adelot continues, in 1888, Rhodes made his third will, leaving everything to Lord Rothschild, his financier in his mining enterprises, with an accompanying letter enclosing the written matter discussed between us. Thus, this one surmises consists of the first will, which was the establishment of the secret society, and the Confession of Faith, since in the postscript, Rhodes says, in considering questions suggested, take the Constitution of the Jesuits if obtainable. And so it goes on to say, the secret society was organized on the conspiratorial patterns of circles within circles, which is what Brother Steve taught us. Professor Quigley informs us that the central part of the secret society was established by March 1891 using Rhodes's money. The organization was run for Rothschild by Lord Alfred Milner, who was discussed in the previous chapter as a key financier of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Roundtable worked behind the scenes at the highest levels of British government, influencing foreign policy and England's involvement in conduct of World War One. Okay, goes on to say Quigley is quoted as saying, at the end of the war in 1914, it became clear that the organization of this system, the Roundtable Group, had to be greatly extended. Once again, the task was entrusted to Lionel Curtis, who established in England and East Dominion a front organization to the existing Roundtable Group. This front organization, called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, had as its nucleus in each area the existing submerged Roundtable Group. Okay, so it's basically saying that this is like one of the first rungs of the outer circle. Okay, in New York, however, the subsidiary or the organization or branch of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, instead of being called that in the United States, it is called instead the Council on Foreign Relations, which was set up in New York, and it says was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Roundtable Group. The American organizers were dominated by a large number of Morgan experts who had gone to the Paris Peace Conference and there became close friends with a similar group of English experts, which had been recruited by the Milner Group. In fact, the original plans for the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations were drawn up in Paris. Okay. I want to go on and read into the record some of the organizations that are ancillary to the Roundtable Group. It says here on page 100 of None Dare Call It Conspiracy. The CFR is totally interlocked with the major foundations and so-called think tanks. Included in the interlock are the Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie Foundations and the Rand Corporation. The Hudson Institute, Fund for the Republic, and Brookings Institute, all are think tanks. Now, just as a side note, when we were talking about Bill Gates, we noted that Bill Gates said that everywhere that he went when he was establishing his foundations, he found that the Rockefeller foundations had been there first. And he basically modeled his foundations on the same premise and largely some of the same purposes as the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay, and so it is highly likely that he is in association with these people. Okay, and so it says the fact that the CFR operates in a near complete autonomy can hardly be accidental. Among the communications corporations represented in the CFR are the National Broadcasting Corporation, or NBC, Columbia Broadcasting System, which is CBS, Time, Life, which now Time is Time Warner now, Life, Fortune Magazine, Look, Newsweek, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, New York Post, the Denver Post, Louisville Courier Journal, Minneapolis Tribune, the Night Papers, McGraw-Hill, Simon & Schuster, book publishers, Harper's Brothers, Random House, Little Brown and Company, Macmillan Company, Viking Press, the Saturday Review, Business Week, and the Book of the Month Club. There's more listed, and that was just on the media front. And we know since the time of the publishment of this book, there's been consolidation within the media, and so we know that that is controlled, and we have seen certainly how much more refined the control is. Okay, and so we talked about some of the foundations. We talked about some of the think tanks, some of the non-media organizations include Standard Oil, IBM, Xerox, Firestone, U.S. Steel, and of course some financial organizations such as Kuhn & Lieb, Lazard Perez, Dillon Reed, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, Chase Manhattan, Morgan Guaranty, and I would also include Citibank, Chase Manhattan Bank, or excuse me, J.P. Morgan Chase, rather. Okay, so I wanted to just read this into the record to basically document who we're talking about when we say the establishment or the deep state or whatever term that you use to refer to them. But it says here in the book on page 101, these are the establishment's official landscape painters, and that's referring to the media, New York Times and NBC. He says these are the establishment's official landscape painters whose job it is to make sure the public does not discover the CFR and its role in creating a world socialist dictatorship. Okay, so we see how Rothschild is involved in this, and we've documented the connections that Rothschild has. We documented that we didn't go too much into the Rockefellers, but and I could go into the documentation, but we'll just suffice it to say, and we'll go back to that another time. But Rockefeller and the Rockefeller family basically are the agents, the United States agents for the Rothschilds, and consequently, when the Federal Reserve was set up, it was largely the Rockefeller banks that are the primary shareholders of it. Okay, so with that, we're going to go move forward. Now that we've established who the establishment is, now we will go a little bit more into Trump and show how he is connected to them. Brother Jamal, would you go ahead and please show or play the clip?
Burdened by debt, the Taj would not turn a profit. By that winter, as Rothman predicted, the casino was in serious trouble.
His business condition was terrible, worse than terrible. We were in a deep recession and people weren't going to Atlantic City. So the revenue stream from Atlantic City, the Taj Mahal, and the other casinos was poor.
Trump's other investments had not fared much better. The Plaza Hotel, a financial disaster. The airline Trump Shuttle was bleeding money.
He sort of blamed the people around him for what went wrong instead of himself.
He started blaming people. He started firing people. Started yelling at people. He said, "I can be a screamer," and he certainly was, according to various accounts.
Trump had long cast himself as a winner. Now he was looking like a loser.
I think that the downtime for him was really a shock, and he was not prepared for it. It caught him totally off guard, but it was probably the biggest challenge of his life.
The Donald is facing an incredible cash crisis.
Big troubles for Donald Trump.
Trump and his companies owed more than $3 billion, much of it to the banks that had fueled his spending spree.
As quickly as the banks loved him, that's as quick as they saw him as a pariah. He was like, ugh, it's Donald Trump. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. They wanted their money, and they wanted to be rid of Donald Trump.
The bankers descended on Trump Tower.
Bankers held gigantic meetings at Trump Tower with like 40 banks, all sitting around in a room. Donald very sober, looking like not quite penitent perhaps, but serious.
When you were talking to him in these meetings, it just didn't seem that he had any idea how big the problem was or how it would be resolved. But he, as far as being a CEO, in understanding numbers and understanding the ramifications, it doesn't seem like he took economics or accounting in college.
Donald Trump's assets are on the line. Citibank and Trump's other lenders are working on a
The bankers
bailout.
faced a fundamental decision.
The Trump Organization confirmed today.
It was at a time when we all were trying to figure out, is it better off this guy being alive financially, or is it better off having him dead financially?
As they stared into the Trump Organization's abyss, the banks came to believe that Trump's assets, the buildings, the casinos, were worth more with his name on them than in foreclosure.
If they were to take Trump out of it, they would no longer have the name for the casinos, which was a tremendous part of their allure. Otherwise, basically, what could they do? Liquidate and take a tremendous hit.
The brand was worth now so much that bankers were willing to take a haircut in order to hang on to the name.
The Trump princess is said to have a price
They
tag
sold
of
the yacht and the
$150
airline,
million. Trump may have to unload the Trump shuttle, worth about
and they put Trump on a $450,000 a month allowance. In exchange, he would continue to promote the business.
I think bankers look at Trump as a promoter, not as a CEO. At least that's the way I looked at him, and if you talk to other bankers, I think they share that opinion. He's a wonderful promoter. He's the P.T. Barnum of the 21st century.
Donald Trump may have pulled off his biggest deal to date.
Donald Trump had survived.
Are working on a bailout plan that would restructure.
He was too big to fail.
The bankers do not want Trump to file for bankruptcy.
Okay. Now, I can personally attest to the facts that were provided in that clip because I happen to work in the banking industry, and I was privy to his the loans that he had outstanding, and then I was at a bank where one of the participants in the loans that he had for his properties, the bank group that participated on those loans were convening meetings to try to figure out what they were going to do. And at the time, as you heard in the video clip or the audio clip, he was on the verge of bankruptcy. And the banks, of course, didn't want him to file bankruptcy. I think he had threatened to do so. And the banks were looking at whether or not they wanted to foreclose on the properties, to be able to collect his debt. Part of the problem, though, was that the value of his properties had gone down, and he was broke, the values of the properties were not sufficient to for him to be able to pay off the debt, even if they did foreclose. So around that time, they started having meetings with him to come up with some type of plan as to how everyone was going to be to be made whole. Now, you may have heard as you were listening to the clip, they did mention a number of banks. Two of them, I believe, were Citibank and J.P. Morgan Chase, which we just discussed are Rockefeller-controlled banks and principal shareholders of the Federal Reserve, and are, by extension, Rothschild banks. Okay, so laying that as some groundwork, I'm going to read from an article that was written on August 9th, 2016, and it's currently on a website called EuropeReloaded.com. And the author is J.C. Collins, and the title of the article is How Rothschild Incorporated Saved Donald Trump. It says, Rothschild's support of Trump has been considerable and strategic over the years. It says, is Trump anti-UN, anti-NATO? Mind you, the UN is established on a Rockefeller property and was essentially set up by the Rockefellers under the direction of the Rothschilds. So is Trump anti-UN, anti-NATO? Is his push really a front for a new international banking global governance initiative? Okay, and so their suggestion is that his rhetoric, anti-United States rhetoric, is hyperbole, essentially. But they point out that he's talked out of both sides of his mouth on the subject. Because it says, Donald Trump has been calling the United States weak and incompetent while stating NATO was obsolete. And then it goes on to say in 2005, Trump said, I have to start by saying I'm a very big fan of the United Nations and all it stands for. So this statement would appear to stand in contrast to the recent campaign announcements. This is at a time when he was running for president. So it says, he's flip-flopped, and people haven't noticed or paid attention to it. And so they go on to say that this apparent flip-flop on the United Nations serves as a method of cognitive dissonance and was promoted by USA Today back in March, ensuring that attention was given to Trump's 2005 statement. But in terms of the cognitive dissonance, people seem to not pay attention to the inconsistencies of his rhetoric. Seemingly wanting to believe that he's some kind of savior. It says in a 1988 interview on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Donald Trump was asked about running for president, and his words and demeanor on the subject of America are verbatim of how he talks in 2016. The talking points of the script were decided almost 30 years ago and draw additional dissonance to the contradictory nature of his past and present comments on the United Nations and other politically charged topics. I'm going to skip on to where it discusses his situation with his real estate properties. Okay, so it says, but there's something about the Trump brand which is suggestive of a longer and more strategized approach. This multi-decade tailoring started in the 1980s with the initial cultural injection of Donald Trump. There's been much written about this time period, but little attention is provided to the obvious manufactured aspects of the Trump image. In the early 1980s, Donald Trump was an up-and-coming real estate developer in New York. There was no connection between the Trump name and casinos or gambling. The obvious nature of the name Trump and its definition related to gambling and card games foretold of the massive empire which would develop in the coming years. In 1987, Donald Trump purchased his first casino interest when he acquired 93% of the shares of Resorts International. Resorts International has a sordid history which began in the 1950s when it evolved from a CIA and Mossad front company which had been established for the purpose of money laundering the profits from drug trafficking and gambling and other illegal activities. The socio-economic engineering benefits of mass population manipulation through means of drug addiction, gambling, and other vices far outweigh those provided by money laundering alone. It can be assumed that money laundering acted as a secondary advantage in much the same way that the subjugation of the Chinese population through the spread of opium financially benefited the East India Trading Company centuries before. On October 30th, 1978, the Spotlight newspaper reported that the principal investors of Resorts International were Meyer Lansky, a mafia member, Tibor Rosenbaum, William Mellon Hitchcock, David Rockefeller, and one Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Michael Collins Piper, in his book, The New Jerusalem, Zionist Power in America, has done an excellent job of describing the relationship between Donald Trump and Resorts International. The following excerpt sums up the relationship. In 1987, upon the death of longtime CIA frontman James Crosby, the nominal head of Resorts International, up-and-coming young New York real estate tycoon Donald Trump stepped into the picture and bought Crosby's interest in the gambling empire. Trump soon became a household name with his colorful personality and his insistence upon naming a variety of luxury hotels, apartment houses, and other commercial ventures after himself. But while the name Trump appeared in the headlines, the names of the real movers behind Resorts International remained hidden from public view. The support of the Rothschilds would become even more apparent. After quickly expanding the reach of Resorts International to Atlantic City in the final years of the 1980s, Trump found himself in financial trouble as the real estate market in New York tanked. The three casinos in Atlantic City, like other Trump assets, were under threat from lenders, which we just listened to on the clip. It was only with the assistance and assurance of Wilbur L. Ross, Jr., Senior Managing Director of Rothschild Incorporated, that Trump was allowed to keep the casinos and rebuild his threatened empire. Mind you, fast forward to Trump being elected president, this same Wilbur Ross served as his chief of staff. The connection between Baron Edmund de Rothschild, being one of the original principal investors of Resorts International and Rothschild Incorporated, allowing Trump to retain ownership over the Atlantic City casinos, which saved him from bankruptcy, should not be considered a coincidence. Great wealth can both create and destroy men if it receives consequence. Donald Trump landed on his feet when, ironically, the real estate market in New York turned and his wealth increased dramatically once more. From there, the Trump empire continued to roll forward and eventually expanded his brand into the realm of reality television, the newest method of socio-economic and cultural engineering. For those wondering, Wilbur L. Ross, Jr. spent 24 years at the New York office of Rothschild Incorporated. In the late 1990s, he started a $200 million fund at Rothschild Incorporated to invest in distressed assets. In 2000, on April Fool's Day, Ross raised an additional $450 million to invest in troubled companies. The timing of this strategy could not have been better, as this report from New York Magazine stated. The 2000 to 2001 worldly stock market crash, 9/11, and a globally synchronous recession pushed scores of companies into bankruptcy. New economy high flyers like Enron, WorldCom, and Global Crossing went bust, but so did the old economy stalwarts in industries such as steel, textiles, victims of excess capacity, global competition, and generous union context. Now, remember I just made the point about how the bankers and Rothschilds would be responsible for inciting panics, recessions, wars, and so on. And so here is basically saying that Wilbur Ross and Rothschild Incorporated positioned themselves to benefit from such a recession by being able to buy distressed properties and companies for cheap. So it says, of course, it's no surprise that billionaire investor Wilbur L. Ross would support the nomination of Donald Trump for president. It would appear that Rothschild supported frontmen like Ross and Trump. It would appear that Rothschild supported frontmen like Ross and Trump do extremely well in the worlds of finance and politics. Trump's proclamations to bring jobs back to America will help industries like steel and textiles and will support both domestic growth and increase in wealth for those like Ross who have invested in distressed American assets. Okay, let's see. So Donald Trump, a valuable resource that may be used, especially as a surprise, in order to gain an advantage, is in fact the establishment candidate for president. I'll read that again. Donald Trump, a valuable resource, may be used, especially as a surprise, in order to gain an advantage, is, in fact, the establishment candidate for president. The difference is that the establishment is one based on the international banking interests and not one based on the interests of domestic American elites, which are more represented by the Jebs, the Mitts, the Teds, and even the Hillarys. I would take issue with that, but we'll see. At no time in the history of the modern world has, in the history of modern world in politics has an anti-establishment candidate. That's the truth. At no time in the history of the modern world in politics has an anti-establishment candidate been given so much media and free airtime. The negative reporting of Donald Trump by most media is scripted as such. The cognitive dissonance is developing surrounding the Trump mandate and transformation of America is a strategy which began decades ago in the 1980s when Trump first began to canvass our television screens. One merely need watch Donald Trump of the past talk about running for president to witness the script in its pure form. All of the talking points about trade deals and bringing jobs back, as well as the United Nations, NATO, and the national debt, all fit within the methodology of the multilateral monetary transition. Okay, that was from that article. And we have another article to read into the record. And this one collaborates the information in the other article. This is from an article written on May 30th, 2021 by Silviu Constantinou. It's in the title of the article is the Trump Rothschild Rockefeller Connections. It says, patriot or not, during an info war and in an attention economy, intellectual laziness is treason. and lack of attention is bankruptcy. And that is exactly why America has just failed. It is incredibly ignorant to say stuff like U.S. government is printing money like crazy. The Rothschilds are. The government is just borrowing their fiat currency at interest. Why? Because the Rothschilds have a hand in everything, everyone, everywhere. A crisis is not a crisis, but a bait allowing the Rothschilds to switch some of the values other people have created. It has them shaking the tree, harvesting, and maybe doing some ritual sacrifice on the side. If you think someone can become a U.S. president without their approval, I have news for you. In 1987, Trump first purchased his casino interest when he acquired 93% of the shares in Resorts International. Resorts International has a sordid history, basically going on to say the same thing in the prior article. And it said that the principal investors before Trump bought it, well, I'll just go ahead and read it anyway, just to have it on the record. It says Resorts International has a sordid history which began in the 1950s when it evolved from the CIA and a Mossad front company, which had been established for the purpose of money laundering the profits from drug trafficking, gambling, and other illegal activities. On October 30th, 1978, the Spotlight newspaper reported that the principal investors of Resorts International were Meyer Lansky, Tibor Rosenbaum, William Millen Hitchcock, David Rockefeller, and one Baron Edmund de Rothschild. So an inquiry into the background of flamboyant American entrepreneur Donald J. Trump provides some surprising insights into Trump's path to power and influence. For the fact is that Trump's rise to stardom came as a direct consequence of having functioned as hardly more than a colorful frontman for some very wealthy behind-the-scenes sponsors. Everyone knows, of course, about Trump's gambling operations and the wide-ranging links of the gambling industry to organized crime. But the story is much bigger than that. In his own memoir, The Art of the Deal, Trump proudly described how in 1987 he bought his first casino interest when he purchased 93% of the voting stock in the Resorts International gambling concern. What Trump doesn't tell his readers is what the late Andrew S. St. George reported in the Spotlight on October 30th, 1978, and in the previous September 25th, 1978 issue. Resorts International was established and controlled by frontmen for the Rockefeller and Rothschild families and their enforcers in the Central Intelligence Agency and its allied intelligence agency, Israel's Mossad. What made the report so explosive was that the newspaper pointed out that the illegally rigged casinos were being operated with the collusion of quote-unquote respectable politicians, law enforcement officials, Wall Street financiers who floated loans to finance the gambling resorts, and the high-profile gambling resort operators themselves. St. George pointed out that many of these casino resorts run by the mob through a variety of frontmen have actually been engaged in a de facto partnership with behind-the-scenes mobsters who have assisted the CIA and the Mossad in massive laundering of drug and gambling profits that have been channeled into covert operations of the two allied intelligence agencies. In return, the CIA and the Mossad, using their own influence, have provided protection for the illegally fixed gambling operations, preventing law enforcement authorities from cracking down on this corruption. Where does this would-be President Trump fit into the picture? To find the answers, one must turn to the murky origins of Resort International. Resorts International evolved from a CIA front company set up in the 1950s by then CIA Director Allen W. Dulles and his close associate, three-term New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, political functionary in the so-called Rockefeller Republican wing of the GOP. The front company in question was the innocuously named Mary Carter Paint Company, which operated a national chain of paint stores, but was set up to function as a covert CIA money laundering operation. In 58-59, Dewey and a number of associates used the reported $2 million in CIA funds to buy a controlling interest in the Crosby Miller Corporation, headed by Dewey's friend James Crosby, which was then merged with Mary Carter. Among other things, the new corporation laundered CIA money for arming the anti-Castro Cuban exiles. The company also launched into lucrative gambling enterprises in the Caribbean, where the CIA was quite active during that period, having engaged the Lansky crime syndicate, that's Meyer Lansky, who we heard as one of the investors in Resource International. Where the CIA was quite active during that period, having engaged the Lansky crime syndicate in now thoroughly documented and widely known plots to topple Fidel Castro, who had enraged the mob by closing down his Cuban gambling enterprises. Thus, it should be no surprise that in 1963, Alvin Malnick, a top henchman of crime syndicate boss Meyer Lansky, was found to be closely connected to the operations of Mary Carter Payne. It goes on to say, the spotlight determined that several principal investors provided the funds and assets for the venture. Meyer Lansky, acknowledged chairman of the board and chief financier of the underworld gambling syndicate, who maintained his own long-standing ties to not only Israel and the Mossad, but also the CIA and the American intelligence community. David Rockefeller, head of the Rockefeller financial empire, who provided his family's clout in CIA and global banking connections to assist in the operation. The Investors Overseas Service, IOS, then the largest flight capital conglomerate controlling assets worth $2.5 billion. Tibor Rosenbaum, who was not only the Mossad's Swiss-based chief financier behind covert arms deals, but also head of the Banque de Credit International of Geneva, the Lansky syndicate's chief European money laundering, and Baron Edmund de Rothschild of the European banking family and a personal business partner of Rosenbaum and Rosenbaum Mossad's related ventures ranging far and wide. And lastly, William Mellon Hitchcock, one of the heirs to the Mellon family fortune, one of America's largest family fortunes, which for many years has also maintained close ties with the CIA. So those again are the individuals who are the principal investors in Resource International, who sold the property to Mr. Trump. Since Trump soon became a household name, which he was, yeah. And, it goes on to basically say that when he fell into financial trouble and turmoil, that it was Wilbur Ross who was working for Rothschild Incorporated, who came to his aid and helped to bail him out. But then it goes on to say that the same Wilbur Ross, still Jacob Rothschild's right-hand man, came out in support of Trump's nomination in March 2016. Michael Collins Piper, in his book, The New Jerusalem, Zionist Power in America, has done an excellent job of describing the relationship between Donald Trump and Resource International. It just goes on to reiterate what we just read into the record. It goes on to repeat what we read in the previous article. The support of the Rothschilds would become even more apparent after quickly expanding the reach of Resource International at Atlantic City in the final years of the 1980s. Trump found himself in financial trouble as the real estate market tanked. It was only with the assistance and assurance of Wilbur L. Ross, senior managing director of Rothschild Incorporated, that Trump was allowed to keep the casinos and rebuild his threatened empire. So this was detailed in a Bloomberg article from March 22nd, 1992. Okay, so it's on record there in a more reputable, quote-unquote, publication. So the connection between Baron Edmund de Rothschild being one of the original principal investors of Resorts International and Rothschild, allowing Donald Trump to retain ownership over the Atlantic City casinos, which saved him from bankruptcy, should not be considered a coincidence. So, for those wondering, Wilbur L. Ross spent 24 years at the New York office of Rothschild. It talks about the same information. Okay. Okay, here we go. I didn't want to read because it was basically summarizing the same information from the prior article, so I didn't want to be repetitive and read that. But it says on November 30th, 2016, the Trump's transition team confirmed reports that Ross 79 had been tapped for Secretary of Commerce. So strike, I said Chief of Staff, so he was correct, and I do remember this. The correct title or position that he was given was Secretary of Commerce during the Trump's administration. Since he was confirmed by the Senate on February 27th, Ross took on a dizzying array of responsibilities at the Commerce Department, including running the Census Bureau, the National Weather Service, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's interesting. His main task is directing trade policy, and on this front, he has echoed Trump's rhetoric calling for the U.S. to free itself from bondage of unfavorable trade agreements. In a joint op-ed with Trump's economic policy advisor, Peter Navarro, in July, Ross criticized previous governments on the trade negotiations. On and on. But I don't want to read any more of this. It's kind of a long article, and it'll take a while to read it all. But the purpose of me reading this, again, was to demonstrate the connection between Donald Trump and the Rothschilds. And so he's directly, not indirectly, he's directly tied to the core of the establishment. So you can't be an outsider and be directly tied to the core of the establishment in the Rothschild family. Now, we note that basically during Trump's administration, Fox was essentially Trump's network. Okay, so here gives a little information and background about Rupert Murdoch. It says Australian-born media mogul, member of the CFR. Remember who the CFR is. CFR is a direct extension of one of the first rungs in the outer circle of the Roundtable Group. Australian-born media mogul, member of the CFR, and billionaire Rupert Murdoch has been friends with Baron Jacob Rothschild since the 1960s. Murdoch controls the Fox Broadcasting Company and was also schooled at Oxford. Oxford is where the Roundtable Group was set up by Cecil Rhodes and Lord Rothschild. Jacob Rothschild served as deputy chairman of Murdoch's B-Sky B Corporation from 2003 to 2007. Murdoch jointly with Jacob Rothschild invested in a 5.5% stake in Genie, which conducts shale gas and oil exploration in, amongst others, Colorado and the occupied Golan Heights. In Kosovo, the International Crisis Group is active, funded by George Soros, Rupert Murdoch, Goldman Sachs, and J.P. Morgan, all Rothschild henchmen. I'll read that again just to let people know that it is not about left versus right. Because people would associate George Soros with the left and Rupert Murdoch with the right. but they're both basically on the same team. It's just an illusion. In Kosovo, the International Crisis Group is active, funded by George Soros, Rupert Murdoch, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan, all Rothschild henchmen. In 2016, Donald Trump welcomed Rupert Murdoch and his wife Jerry Hall for dinner at his golf course in Scotland. There's a lot here. The Blackstone Group and BlackRock. Okay. So Blackstone is one of the many investment funds of Jacob Rothschild. That's deep. Just as a side note, back when, after the Rodney King verdict and the ensuing rebellion took place, I was out on my way to some meetings with community groups, and someone from the Blackstone Group handed me a card, and they were there basically surveying the scene. I didn't know who they were or what the Blackstone Group was about. That's interesting. Anyway, so Blackstone is one of the many investment funds of Jacob Rothschild. The Blackstone Group was founded in 1985 by Peter George Peterson and Stephen A. Schwarzman. The CEO of Blackstone, Stephen Schwarzman, became an economic advisor to Donald Trump and chairman of Donald's Business Advisory Council, the Strategic and Policy Forum. Schwarzman and President Trump had a meeting. There's a picture of Schwarzman and Trump at a meeting with business leaders. There's also a picture of Ghislaine Maxwell. I'm sure you know who she is, and Rupert Murdoch, and another picture of Ghislaine Maxwell with Schwarzman. And I happen to have some pictures of Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell as well. Stephen Schwarzman was initiated in the Skull and Bones in 1969, and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, I didn't know that, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin became a Bonesman in 1985. And if you don't know about Skull and Bones, maybe we'll do a talk on that. But I'd encourage you to go into the Steve Coakley archives, who has done an excellent job of explaining who they are. Jared and his brother Josh Kushner, Jared Kushner being a husband of one of Trump's daughters, also worked for Blackstone. Kushner partnered with BlackRock on some investments as well. The family Trump invests most of their money in is BlackRock investment funds. George Soros. Rothschild agent George Soros was involved with Trump in a bankruptcy fraud in the General Motors building in New York. Soros, together with Goldman Sachs and Peter Thiel, funded the Cadre investment firm with $250 million in early 2015. Kushner forgot to disclose that he is indebted for more than $1 billion from 20 investors, including Blackstone Group, Bank of America, Citigroup, UBS, Deutsche Bank, and Royal Bank of Scotland. George Soros is the secret financier behind Kushner-backed startup Cadre. Kushner again, son-in-law of Trump. In 2009, Mnuchin, who was the Secretary of Treasury under Trump, was involved in a group of investors, including George Soros and John Paulson, to buy the IndyMac Bank that had been shut down in 2008, and afterwards they renamed it One West Bank. It was sold a few years later with a profit of of billions. Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Trump didn't fly the Lolita Express that much because he had his own jets, more than one. But first time Ghislaine Maxwell stepped aboard one of them, it wasn't to party. She was just a child accompanying her father, Jewish mogul and spy Robert Maxwell, to a business meeting with the New York developer Donald Trump. It wasn't a rare occasion that they met. Both the Clintons and Donald Trump were really good friends with Jeffrey Epstein. I'll read that again. Both the Clintons and Donald Trump were good friends with Jeffrey Epstein, who pleaded guilty to sexually abusing underage girls and running a pedophile sex ring. We know what happened to him. So Epstein arranged underage girls for, amongst others, Prince Andrew. Donald Trump provided his private jet for Prince Andrew to meet with his good friend Epstein. Epstein was also a member of Trump's Mar-a-Lago, where the underage Virginia Roberts was recruited by another pedophile, the girlfriend of Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell. And there's a series of pictures with Rothschild, Evelyn de Rothschild, Lynn Forster, the Rothschild, Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and then pictures of Donald Trump with the Clintons smiling at a party. There's so much to unpack here, but and here's a picture here with Donald Trump, Melania Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell. Some of the interesting names in the Little Black Book of Jeffrey Epstein include Donald Trump, Ivana Trump, Ivanka Trump, Evelyn de Rothschild, Jessica Rothschild, probably the daughter of Evelyn, Hannah Rothschild, probably the daughter of Jacob, Edward de Rothschild, and David Rockefeller, Peter Soros, Henry Kissinger, Rupert Murdoch, Alan Dershowitz, Ehud Barak, Tony Blair, Prince Andrew, Fergie, Prince Bandar, Prince Michael Prince, Princess Olga of Greece, Peter Mandelson, John Paulson, David Koch, and a bunch with the surname Kennedy. Yeah, well, there's a lot more here. But I think we've done enough to establish the connection between Donald Trump and the Rothschilds, who are at the core of the establishment, or what people would now refer to as the deep state. So I think we can rest our case. Guilty as charged. So I hope those of you now understand Trump's connection and his purpose. He is not a savior. He is not someone who is an outsider. He is an insider. He's a front man, and basically carrying out a role that has been scripted for him over 30 years. So I hope that doesn't, well, it does burst a lot of people's bubble, and I'm not sorry for it. But, you know, we're about, you know, finding the truth, and, you know, what they say about the truth. The truth will set you free. All right, so I think that's all I have for the Brother Jamal says he's not sorry. So I think that's all for tonight. There's a lot more in this article, but I'm actually tired of reading right now, and maybe we'll pick it up the next time. But I hope that you found this beneficial and informative, and we'll see you next time here on Journey into Self, and we'll try to post this up on YouTube and see how long it lasts. And I'll just say there was a quite informative YouTube video on this subject, and I went looking for it and did not find it. So it seems to be a sensitive issue that someone doesn't want to be discussed, but we discussed it here, and hopefully it'll stay so that people can review it. But I do highly recommend getting the book, The World Order, by Eustace Mullins. It's quite informative. I don't agree with some of his conclusions, but the information is very on point. And then do get the book None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. Also very informative. And you should have it in your library. And the book that I was trying to remember that has a page or a whole chapter missing from it is Behold a Pale Horse, which in current editions, chapter 15 has been deleted. Okay, so with that, thank you for joining us here on Journey into Self, and we'll see you next time. What's up?